One waitress, one arrogant millionaire, and a grand piano. What started as a cruel attempt to humiliate her would turn into a moment that silenced the room and shattered egos. You won't believe how she turned the tables with nothing but her talent. It was a warm Friday evening in Raleigh, North Carolina, and La Fontaine, an upscale restaurant tucked into the heart of the city, was alive with the hum of conversation. The clinking of glasses, the soft footsteps of waiters, and the subtle strains of a jazz piano in the corner created an atmosphere of refined indulgence. For most, it was just another evening of fine dining. But for Deborah, a 25-year-old waitress, it was the backdrop of a life she dreamed of, and one she was about to redefine. Deborah had always been different from the other waitstaff. Beneath her quiet demeanor and professional uniform was a woman who carried dreams much bigger than the luxurious restaurant around her. Music was her passion, her refuge. The piano was where she found herself, where she could pour every emotion and thought that words couldn't express. Yet for all the dreams she held close, reality had grounded her firmly in the present. Serving at La Fontaine wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. The pay was steady, and it was a stepping stone toward her larger dream of attending the music academy. Yet even as she moved from table to table, balancing plates with a smile, there was always the piano in the corner, its polished wood and gleaming keys a reminder of the life she longed for. Few knew about Deborah's talent. The staff had occasionally caught her stealing moments during breaks, playing on the old upright piano in the back room. She kept it to herself, not wanting to attract attention. Not from customers, not from anyone. But tonight, everything was about to change. When Leonard Grayson, a wealthy entrepreneur known for his arrogance and sharp tongue, walked into the restaurant, everything in the room seemed to shift. His entrance was grand, as usual, flanked by companions who followed his every move. He exuded an air of superiority, and his presence made even the most seasoned waitstaff stand straighter. For most of the team, Leonard was just another difficult guest, a man who thrived on pushing people's buttons for amusement. Deborah, however, had seen many difficult customers in her years at the restaurant. To her, Leonard was just another table to serve, until he locked eyes with her. Something about Deborah caught his attention. In that instant, Leonard decided she would be the entertainment for the night. As Deborah moved between tables, balancing plates and offering polite smiles, she couldn't shake the feeling that Leonard's gaze was always on her. At first, she dismissed it. After all, she had learned long ago how to tune out the uncomfortable stares of certain guests. But Leonard wasn't like the others. His eyes followed her, watching her every move with a calculating intensity that made her feel exposed. It wasn't long before he made his move. "Deborah," Leonard called out, his voice cutting through the air. She froze for a moment, a brief flicker of unease creeping into her chest. She turned toward him, her gaze steady but her heart beginning to race. "Sounds like someone with a lot of hidden talents," Leonard remarked, his tone dripping with mockery. The comment caught her off guard, and for a moment, Deborah wasn't sure how to respond. She forced a smile, trying to maintain her composure, but inside she could feel the heat of his words seeping into her skin. Leonard's smirk deepened as he made his remark, and something inside Deborah told her this wasn't just a casual observation. It was a challenge. She turned away quickly, moving to place an order at another table, hoping to shake off the discomfort. But Leonard wasn't finished with her yet. He wasn't done making her the object of his amusement. As the evening wore on, Leonard's behavior grew more deliberate. He held court at his table, recounting tales of his wealth and success, peppering in jabs about people who lacked the ambition and drive he so proudly carried. His entourage laughed dutifully, feeding into the spectacle. But for Deborah, this wasn't just an act. It was a reminder that people like Leonard never saw her as anything more than a servant. He wasn't just rude, he was cruel. By the time the appetizers were served, Leonard had already begun his performance. He loudly recounted more of his stories, throwing around his wealth as though it was the measure of his worth. But it wasn't his stories that caught Deborah's attention. It was the way he spoke to her when she returned to his table with a bottle of wine. "Tell me, Deborah," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the noise of the restaurant. "What do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely someone like you has dreams." The words hit Deborah harder than she expected. She wasn't prepared for this question. She didn't want to share her dreams with him, not after the way he had been looking at her. But Leonard was waiting for an answer, eager to see if he could provoke her further. "I play piano sometimes," she said, her voice steady, though the nerves were starting to creep in. She wasn't looking for validation. She didn't want to entertain his mockery. But Leonard, already sensing an opportunity, smiled wider. "A pianist, huh? How fascinating," he said, his voice louder now, almost taunting. "Why don't you give us a little performance? Surely someone with your talent isn't afraid of a little audience?" The challenge was clear, the ridicule dripping from his words. Leonard was daring her to fail in front of everyone. Deborah could feel the weight of the challenge in the room. All eyes turned toward her. The diners around her shifted in their seats, waiting for her next move. Leonard's companions laughed, egging her on, already anticipating her discomfort. Deborah stood frozen for a moment. The last thing she wanted was to perform for this man, but something inside her stirred. The piano wasn't just an instrument. It was her escape, her voice, and Leonard wasn't going to take that away from her. She glanced toward the piano, her heart racing. The idea of sitting down to play in front of an audience, especially one that had been mocking her, terrified her. But there was no turning back now. She couldn't back down. This wasn't just about him. This was about standing up for herself. "Fine," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'll play." The room held its breath as she walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last, but Deborah didn't falter. She wasn't playing for Leonard, and she wasn't playing for anyone else. She was playing for herself, for the dreams she had kept hidden for so long. Deborah approached the grand piano, each step heavy with the weight of the challenge Leonard had thrown her way. The room was eerily silent now, all eyes on her as she walked toward the gleaming keys. The soft glow of the chandelier above cast a spotlight on her, isolating her from the crowd. For a moment, she almost felt like an imposter, out of place, vulnerable, exposed. But there was no turning back. With a deep breath, Deborah slid onto the bench, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the polished keys. She could feel Leonard's gaze burning into her, the smug satisfaction he wore on his face still visible. But as her fingers brushed the first notes, she let the music take over. The opening notes were soft, almost tentative. The silence in the room was thick, every diner hanging on her, every move. Deborah's hands shook slightly, but she steadied herself. The moment her fingers found their rhythm, the nerves began to dissipate. This wasn't just a performance for Leonard. This was her moment to reclaim her dignity, her talent, and her voice. She chose a piece she knew by heart, Claire de Lune by Debussy. The familiar melody began to spill from the piano, delicate and soulful, filling the air with its beauty. The room, once filled with tension and mockery, seemed to soften as the music grew. With every note, Deborah's confidence grew. Her fingers moved with the grace and fluidity of someone who had spent years perfecting her craft. The music poured out like a confession, weaving through the air, each chord carrying the weight of her dreams. Dreams that Leonard had tried to dismiss, dreams that had been put on hold for too long. The room had grown completely silent. Leonard, once so confident in his mockery, now sat still, his smirk replaced by something Deborah couldn't quite place. The diners, once whispering and shifting uncomfortably in their seats, now leaned in, drawn into the music. They could feel the power of Deborah's talent, the raw emotion behind every note. Deborah wasn't just playing the piano. She was telling a story, her story, the sacrifices of her mother, the struggles she had faced, the dreams she had fought to keep alive. The music swelled, filling the restaurant with a presence that no one could ignore. By the time she struck the final chord, the room was still. The echo of the piano resonated through the air, lingering like a soft breath. Deborah sat frozen for a moment, her hand resting gently on the keys, unsure of what would happen next. And then, as if a spell had been broken, the room erupted into applause. The sound was thunderous, reverberating off the walls, shaking the very foundation of the restaurant. Some diners stood, clapping with such fervor that Deborah felt a tear well up in her eye. Her colleagues, who had been watching from the sidelines, joined in, their faces alight with pride. But Leonard didn't stand. He remained seated, his face a mask of surprise and discomfort. His slow, reluctant clap was a far cry from the enthusiastic applause that surrounded him. But even his hollow gesture couldn't diminish the power of what Deborah had just done. She had taken control. She had reclaimed her voice, and no one, not Leonard, not anyone, could take that away from her. As the applause died down, Deborah slowly stood. Her knees were still trembling, but her back was straight, her head held high. She glanced around the room, and for the first time that evening, she saw the people watching her not as spectators, but as witnesses. Their expressions were filled with admiration, respect, and even awe. She didn't look at Leonard right away. Instead, she nodded to the diners, who had clapped the loudest, offering them a faint smile. It wasn't pride she felt, but relief. Relief that she had shown them, and herself, what she was capable of. Then her gaze shifted to Leonard. He was still seated, his hands clasped in front of him, trying to maintain some semblance of control. His face was no longer the confident, mocking mask he had worn earlier. It was something different, something that Deborah couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps it was discomfort. Perhaps it was defeat. "Well," Leonard finally said, breaking the silence with an awkward chuckle, "that was unexpected." He cleared his throat, trying to salvage his dignity. "I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places." The comment was weak, a hollow attempt to recover from his earlier arrogance. Deborah tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. His words were meant to be an olive branch, but they were empty. She had silenced him with nothing but the purity of her craft. "Thank you," Deborah said, her voice calm and deliberate. "It wasn't about proving anything to you. I just wanted to play." Leonard shifted uncomfortably, clearly unnerved by the collective gaze of the room. He fidgeted with his drink, his usual bravado slipping further with every passing second. Deborah wasn't interested in his half-hearted apology. She had said everything she needed to with her music. "Everyone has a gift," Deborah continued, her voice steady. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The room seemed to hold its breath once again. Leonard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly realizing that he had miscalculated. The diners, once intrigued by his spectacle, now returned their focus to their meals, the energy in the room having shifted completely. Where there had once been privilege and arrogance, there was now something richer, a shared respect for Deborah in the authenticity she had displayed. As Leonard and his entourage left quietly, Deborah stood tall. She wasn't thinking about Leonard anymore. Her mind was already on the next step. The night had ended with unexpected generosity. Her tips were enough to cover her rent and give her some extra funds for piano lessons. As she walked home, the crisp air filling her lungs, Deborah felt something she hadn't felt in years: certainty. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was an artist. And no one, not Leonard, not anyone, could take that away from her. Inspired by Deborah's story? Don't let fear hold you back. Embrace your talent and show the world what you're made of. Subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Your story could be next.